Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Answers from the Lab, where we share Mayo Clinic knowledge and advancements on the state of testing and science from laboratory leaders and the people who are making it happen behind the scenes. I'm Dr. Bobbi Pritt, Interim Chair of the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. With me today is Dr. Bill Morice, the President and CEO of Mayo Clinic Laboratories. This is our weekly discussion with Dr. Morice, in which we learn about updates in the field of laboratory medicine and pathology. Hi, Bill. Welcome back.
Hey, yeah, welcome back after hopefully enjoyable July 4th holiday week. I was thinking about you a lot because there's been a ton of rain in northern Minnesota and a lot of long grass, and watching out for those
ticks.
Vector-borne infections.
Yeah.
Those ticks are everywhere, not to mention mosquitoes and every other kind of biting bug.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Make sure you're prepared when you go outside. Go outside by all means. Enjoy the great outdoors, but make sure you use your tick repellents and your long clothing and all of that, and your sunscreen, of course. So
the good old ABCs, but
yeah,
that's not what we're here to talk about today. Because one of the things that was interesting going into the holiday week was a Supreme Court decision, which I think caught a lot of people's attention.
Right. It was very interesting, Bill. It was on June 28th, the Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo. The Supreme Court overturned what has been called the Chevron doctrine. And that really reinforced that Congress and the courts are responsible for writing and interpreting laws, not federal agencies. So I know you've done a lot of reading and work on this. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the background?
Well, yeah, well, sir, I mean, the reality is I'm probably much more well versed in federal agencies and how they interpret and enforce regulations than I would ever have hoped to have been when I entered medical school.
Same here.
Be that as it may, it is really important, and I think it caught a lot of our people's attention in laboratorians because of the FDA oversight of LDTs, and at the essence of this really is going back, and you and I have talked about this before, but the federal agencies, their ability to regulate is actually granted through Congress. So Congress passes laws that say this agency can regulate this activity or this industry in this way, right? And in fact, that's where some of the conversations around ballot were. This would be a legislative. The Congress would get all the stakeholders in Congress to say, well, FDA is going to oversee LDTs, laboratory developed tests. Here are the parameters by which they would do it, right? The question is, does the FDA need that legislation? Of course, they said they didn't. They said they had the authority in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, which was passed, I think, in the mid-1970s, right? That it's in there. People challenges it in there, and it's been the stance over the last several years and decades that the federal agencies have a pretty broad canvas on which to interpret the laws of Congress and where they regulate and where they don't. What this recent Supreme Court decision is saying is that actually, no, we think that that's an overstep. It's not the purpose of these agencies to actually establish new rules and new policies. Those have to go through Congress, and that the courts now have they have more of a role in deciding whether or not an agency actually has the authority within past laws to do what they want to do, right? So it becomes really pertinent as you start to think about all the conversation around the FDA oversight of LDTs.
Yeah, it could potentially limit how much federal agencies like the FDA, as that's very applicable right now, can interpret laws passed by Congress if there are aspects that are perhaps a little vague.
Exactly. And there's because or we've learned again, these legislative vehicles, these bills often have just areas it's complex, right? Or they're written at a time when things aren't anticipated. I mean, I was not even in medical school in the 70s, but I remember getting textbooks, and what was available as a lab test and a laboratory developed test in the 1970s, a lot different than where the world we live in today in 2024. But clearly that legislation didn't have things in there around that. And you could see where the courts might say, the FDA, this is probably pretty big. a departure, and this falls right into that kind of gray zone where you say that you've had the authority for several decades and haven't enforced it, but a court might step in and say, no, the law doesn't really say that you have that authority, which would, of course, be another thing which would throw a whole kind of everything up in the air.
Yeah, and maybe we should take a step back and talk about what that Chevron doctrine, so-called Chevron doctrine, was, and so why it's important now that it's been overturned. The Chevron document really had determined that courts should defer to the expertise of federal agencies if there's ambiguity. So it really gave a lot of leeway to federal regulatory agencies like the FDA. But now that that's been overturned, I think that agency interpretations are now going to be subject to greater scrutiny by the courts, especially if there's a lawsuit, for example.
Exactly. Exactly. Now, how all this will play out, we don't really know. It turns out even that there are different, there's different courts or different districts, excuse me, of the federal courts that have different approaches to. Some have been more lenient in terms of providing agencies leeway for interpretation versus others. So there's still a lot of variables here. The other big variable as we think about coming into a presidential election season is, what does this mean if there's a new administration in the White House?
Mhm.
Because it's the White House that appoints the commissioners for these agencies, and would they appoint people with a legislative background or court background that would be more conservative in this way? So we don't know what it means. A lot of things that we don't know what it means, but and it's not, again, we're talking about laboratory developed tests, but there are other, HHS has CMS in it that makes decisions around reimbursement and other things. So this isn't the only ramification for healthcare. It's probably the most pertinent for us in the lab side, but it will have real implications because healthcare is one of the more heavily regulated activities in the country. And of course, labs are one of the more heavily regulated activities within healthcare. So we're gonna see some kind of ripple effect here, no doubt.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what comes out of this. And in response to the decision, we've already had some of our representatives raising issues. In fact, Representative Bill Cassidy, who's a physician, he sent a letter to FDA asking how the agency plans to implement this new framework, considering the fact that under the new ruling, in his words, many of the agency's actions in recent years are now considered to be outside the bounds of its authority. So we'll have to see how all this plays out and if it's going to impact the new FDA ruling and, of course, other potential regulations by other aspects of the government and
Yeah,
governmental agencies.
agreed. And I think that's actually the Cassidy's has some very talented healthcare people on his staff, and I think that letter is part of the public record. If it is, it's
Hmm.
worth a read because it really does lay it out quite well, and other areas beyond, because it's not, Senator Cassidy as a physician. So it's other areas of healthcare are also pointed out there, not just laboratory developed tests in the letter. And that's really important because Senator Cassidy's on the Senate Health Committee, which is health, education, labor, and pension, I think is the piece. So they're a very influential Senate sub or committee on healthcare. So the politics will only ramp up around this too, which is
Yeah.
not surprising, I guess. So
Yeah, there'll be lots of legal, regulatory issues and politics to go along with it that we will be able to discuss and provide updates on.
yeah, I think it goes back to kind of as you and I discussed when the FDA first came out with its final rule. I think a lot of people were like, "Oh, well, at least we know." But the reality is, in some ways, it's even more ambiguous now in terms of how labs are going to move forward than it was before the final rule was issued. So I think it's just really important for people to stay engaged and to listen. Even here, legal experts are still quite there's no great consensus on what this means for the FDA final rule on laboratory developed tests. So just all the more reasons to stay engaged. I will
Hmm.
say that your Congress representation might get more engaged on this issue, and therefore it's really important to think about writing letters or inviting your congressional representatives to visit your laboratory so they understand, what you provide for healthcare. Because I do, just like the Senator Cassidy letter, this new ruling of the Supreme Court, for those who are interested in curtailing, or balancing regulation and see more curtailing your agency activity is important. They're going to want to understand this, and so I think it's just another area, just stay engaged, and
Yeah.
both individually and working through your professional societies. Sorry.
I was going to say the exact same thing, Bill. If you don't feel comfortable reaching out by yourself, you can go through your professional societies. Often they have form letters or template letters, which then I would recommend customizing. So it's not just the same old form letter, but you could really add how it might be meaningful and impactful to you. But this is the time to reach out to your representatives.
Yep. And last but not least, I'll circle back to, I jokingly said this is something I didn't think about when I was in medical school, because I certainly didn't. But honestly, it's an important area. And if you're interested, there couldn't be probably a better time to think about the interaction between government and our profession, between PAMA, which we haven't talked about, and this LDT issue. There's just a lot of really important issues being discussed for healthcare and how diagnostics are going to be supported. And so it's a good time to get engaged and to think about and even just read and understand, because I think it gives you some real perspectives. And it is really important for us to be knowledgeable, because the reality is, even at the FDA, they don't have a lot of experience with clinical laboratories at all.
Mm-hmm.
So even the people that are thinking about these issues don't tend to have a depth of experience. So just really good time to learn, to stay engaged, and to try and understand and contribute.
Yeah, absolutely. So listen to us, join us. We'll do our best to keep you updated.
We'll do our best and entertained at the same time.
There you go. Well, thanks, Bill, for joining me. And as always, really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Have a great week ahead.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Answers from the Lab. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast, and don't forget to tune in every Thursday and every other Tuesday.